But the courts are now going to seal all records for non-payment of rent cases, which means as a landlord or a property manager, you're not going to be able to look up to see if Joe, I'm a tenant renter, ever got evicted for non-payment of rent. Those records will not be available to you anymore. However, an eviction for breach of clause for a tenant at will or for a term contract for breach will not be a sealed record any longer. We're going to have the same odds of collecting a monetary judgment, which are slim to none. The only difference is those records will not be sealed. Hey, what's up, all of my real estate peeps? This is Brian Lucier with the Why Not Real Estate podcast, Golden Nugget, where we will take a tip, tactic, or technique and unpack it that you can use it in your real estate investor tool belt to better increase your profit, bottom line, and operations. Well, if you've been following the market trends and some of our other yellow podcasts over the past year, you're going to know that the market is slowly changing. If you go back to some of those other episodes, you'll know that one of the key indicators that's been keeping the market from shifting to the next cycle has been inventory. So inventory is starting to trickle back up, which is now releasing the pressure to get to the next market cycle. We also have a phenomenon that has happened since COVID where the government has stopped or actually stepped in to pay people rent and keep them from being evicted and homeless. I'm not going to get into the details of how all this works, but I am going to let you know that it has become more commonplace for a tenant to look at us and say, look, I'm not going to be able to afford to pay the rent this month, so I'm going to apply for a government assistance program. And by law, we have to take it. Now, here's the problem with that. It gets tied up in the court at the speed of lawyers. Usually takes 6 to 8 weeks for the landlord to get their money. In the meantime, the bills still need to be paid. Mortgages still need to be paid. So here's the problem. The problem is, how do you file the court case? So I need to unpack a few different things here. First, what type of lease is it? And I'm going to stick to the two main types. You've got a tenant at will agreement. In a tenant at will agreement, it's a month-to-month basis. You pay the rent on the first, you live there for the month, and then the beginning of the next month, the cycle starts all over again. So it's a 30-day cycle. You have a tenancy for 30 days. Under a tenancy at will, if you're going to terminate the lease, all you need to do is really put it in writing that it's a 30-day no-fault termination of the lease. A 30-day period is a full rental period. So at the shooting of this video, it's in the middle of the month. So if I served a notice today, a full rental period would be from the 1st of next month until the end of that rental period. So a common mistake is if you send the notice on the 1st of the month, at the end of the month is a 30-day notice. That's not how it works. If you send the notice on the 1st of the month, then you have to wait until the 1st of the next month and a full rental period. So it's actually 2 months if you send it on the 1st of the month, calendar months. The other type of lease is a term lease, and the most common for that is a 1-year term. So if I start a lease in March, it continues the full year to the end of February the next year. So you have a tenant at will and you have a term lease. Let's talk about the term lease. The only way you can terminate a term lease, that's a 1-year lease, is by a breach of one of the terms and clauses in the contract. You can only terminate during a lease for breach or violation of the contract. And it needs to be clearly written in the lease, and it needs to clearly say, if you do this, it is a termination. And then your termination clause needs to be defined in the lease. it gets a little detailed to do it correctly. So you've got a tenant at will, you've got a term lease. If I want to end a tenant at will lease, that's the 30-day. All I need to do is send a 30-day notice, which is encompassing a 30-day rental period from the first and last of the month after you receive the notice. Again, to review a term lease, the only way to terminate a term lease is by actually defining a clause that was violated and then citing the termination clause in the lease. I had to set the ground rules there, okay? I had to set what all this is. Now, we're going to talk about the two types of court cases that we might file and why we're going to be changing our strategy. That's the real key here. Typically, the last 5, 10, 15 years, a term lease, if we didn't collect rent, we've got two options. We have to do by breach, which we've already talked about, or we could do a non-payment of rent. Now, the thing with a non-payment of rent in a term lease is every single month that you issue that non-payment of rent for a term lease, all the tenant needs to do to cure the lease is to pay the rent. So if I issue a non-payment of rent under a term agreement to Joe, I'm a tenant, all Joe, I'm a tenant needs to do is pay the rent. And then the whole court case goes away. Of course, there's filing fees, lawyer fees, and all that, which is a pain in the butt because next month, Joe, I'm a tenant could be late again, and we could do this 12 months out of the term of the lease, possibly 11 months because the first month they would have paid the rent to even get in there. So that can be a problem. If you're doing a non-payment of rent, especially now with government assistance involved, because it kicks the can down the road 6 to 8 weeks every time you do a non-payment of rent. And this is a cycle. Now that the government will step in and pay someone's rent, it's just going to keep happening because the tenants have learned, I don't have to pay the rent. I'll wait until I get the notice, go to court. The courts will kick that court date down the road 2 weeks. Maybe I get the assistance, maybe I don't, but I've lived there now for 2 or 3 months free. This isn't working for our clients, and this isn't working for our landlords. On the other side of it, if you do a non-payment of rent or a tenant at will, the court still sees under a tenant at will agreement, if you've had to file more than 2 non-payment of rents within a 12-month period, on the third one, you can ask for possession. So it makes sense. Why would you even do a tenant at will, or why would you even do a term lease? Our position for decades has been to do a term lease, because if we're going to do breach, you can't counterclaim on a term lease. That means you can't do interrogatories, discoveries, or ask 30 questions. On a tenant at will, even if you do a non-fault, they can say, hold it, I want legal aid, I want to do my interrogatories, and I want to find out why you're evicting me, because I think you should let me stay. There's the baseline of everything that's going on, and this is what we're hitting now in today's market. And I've been telling people now for the past year, we have had more active eviction cases in the last 2 years than we have had eviction cases combined in the last 20. On any given month, we've got a half dozen raft applications open, which is government assistance. And it isn't ending. The cycle is there. We're even seeing people now, when they apply for the apartment and they want to rent from you, they say, great, I'll take the apartment. However, here's my raft application to pay for first, last, and security, which is a red flag to us that tells us, great, they're going to get their first, last, and security and move in. And probably in about 2 to 3 months, we're going to be in court because they're already familiar with raft and already know they don't have to pay rent and can get 2 or 3 free months of rent. So what do? Deep breath. Our position, our strategy right now is changing. What we used to do in the past, we're not going to be doing moving forward. Our lease right now, we're still doing leases, but I want to talk about that a little bit. Our lease right now has clauses in there say if you don't pay rent on time, that's a breach of a lease. So our position now in our leases, not to do non-payment of rent. If we know that a tenant just is not going to work out and can't afford the unit, we're not going to go through the 6 to 8 weeks of not collecting rent. We are going to go immediately for a breach of contract, a breach of lease, and get possession back. Will we be able to do a monetary judgment? Yes, we can add that on. But even if we do a non-payment of rent and need to evict the person, either way, if we do a non-payment of rent or if we do the breach of lease and get a monetary judgment, chances are slim to none we're ever going to collect it. So the best strategy for us is to seek possession back now and get a new tenant in there who can afford to pay the rent. There's another level going on here. Eviction sealing, and if you don't know what that is, go to masslandlords.org or .net and find out what's going on. But the courts are now going to seal all records for non-payment of rent cases, which means as a landlord or a property manager, you're not going to be able to look up to see if Joe, I'm a tenant renter, ever got evicted for non-payment of rent. Those records will not be available to you anymore. However, an eviction for breach of clause for a tenant at will or for a term contract for breach will not be a sealed record any longer. We're going to have the same odds of collecting a monetary judgment, which are slim to none. The only difference is those records will not be sealed. So we're going to be shifting our court case position to now move to breach of the contract, either of a tenant at will or of a term lease agreement. So that's important to note. Now, the next thing we're going to be shifting as we move forward, renting to new tenants, we're going to move away from the model of a term agreement, which limits us under a non-payment for eviction, and it limits us during the term. If they don't breach the lease, we can't evict them. We're married together for that year until it terminates. So we want to move to a tenant at will agreement. Another reason we're doing this, as I alluded to at the beginning of this segment, the market is shifting and changing. So I think we're really going to start to see more property exchanging hands. A lot of these owners who've been holding on to their properties because of high interest rates are now realizing this is where the market is and it may be time to sell. So we're going to see more inventory come into the market. What does that mean for our current clients? It means some of our clients may want to benefit from this market cycle right now and actually sell their properties. So what we're going to do as a property manager for our clients, as leases renew, term leases renew, we're going to switch them over into a tenant at will. And I mentioned this in the last video, the yellow video, refi or sell. It becomes very important if you're going to refi or sell if you have a term lease agreement, which is for a year usually, or a tenant at will agreement. There's going to be much more flexibility for our sellers to sell their building under a tenant at will. If you have a 3-family and everybody's tenant at will, okay, you can approach one of the tenants and say, look, we've got a buyer coming in. They want to live in your unit. We'll negotiate with you. We'll pay for your moving expense. We'll do X, Y, Z, but you have to move, and here's your 30-day notice. No fault to you, but this is what we need to do. Or we may offer to any of the tenants. Whoever wants to move, we'll give you a moving bonus and put you in. We have other rentals. We'll put you in another one of our rentals, and we'll pay for the move. So that increases the flexibility for our owners to sell an asset, because now instead of just selling it to an investor, they can widen the spectrum of people who might buy that property to owner-occupieds who would be interested in it, okay? The downside, and we just had this happen and I reviewed it in the last video, we have an owner of a 2-family who just leased up the whole building with term tenants for a year and now wants to sell. Well, he's stuck having to only be able to sell it to an investor. Investors are going to be a harder negotiation. It's not going to be a wider pool. If he had a wider pool of owner-occupied buyers, there may be a bidding war where someone will pay a little bit extra to get the opportunity and benefit to live in a house where they can collect rent. So I know I put a lot on your plate on this one. If I could try to summarize it, there are two types of leases. A term, which is usually set for a year, and we have a tenant at will, which is a 30-day notice. Then we have two types of evictions. We have for cause, which is a breach of the lease, or we have a non-payment of rent. And then the last part of this, if you're prepping the property for sale, which I think more of our owners are going to be looking at as an option, then we want to transition our term leases over to tenant at will agreements to open up the opportunity for our sellers and our clients to have a wider spectrum of buyers for their rental property. A lot in this one to digest. I really hope it was helpful. Definitely go back, take notes, and listen to it again if you need to. And this is Brian Lucier of the Why Not Real Estate Podcast, Golden Nuggets, looking at terms and leases and non-evictions and non-payment of rents and different types of evictions. From the podcast, all of us, all my real estate peeps, this is Brian Lucier signing off, and we'll see you on the next one.